Hail and well met, Slayers of Giants. Welcome to Chapter 3 of my serial novel, Tilting at Windmills. Remember, this is a draft. I'll be very grateful for your feedback throughout, so please comment away on whatever platform you're finding this, and become a patron on my Patreon or subscribe to my Substack so you'll get a little reminder each week when a new chapter comes out. Here's Chapter 3, Charging Wind Turbines. The day Benjamin arrived in Oregon, he rented a van, went to his storage facility with his newly ex-wife to divide up their possessions, helped her move into her new apartment, said a heartbroken goodbye to his dogs, and returned the rental. He ran these errands in a feverish stupor. Benjamin habitually hid from his own strongest emotions through work, exhausting himself with chores until he could fall asleep without too much time staring at the ceiling. He suspected he'd learned this from his father, who worked long hours during Benjamin's childhood and still, in his retirement, volunteered full-time. Benjamin didn't know if his father had done this to hide from emotions as he did, but Benjamin knew the strategy worked, at least for him, and at least in a temporary way, though he'd been warned by more than one true friend that the feelings would catch up with him one day or twist themselves into some physical ailment. Rolando, on the other hand, managed to be at peace even when circumstances should have dictated anxiety, and when things got really bad, he generally became more exuberant rather than despondent or avoidant. This was the product of the code of chivalry, as he would soon explain to Serge as they made their way down I-5 to Corvallis. But first, Rolando had to demonstrate his nature and profession to his new chauffeur through his actions, such that Serge was ready to understand. As they drove down the freeway, having merged from I-205 to I-5 and continuing south, Poe, whose eyes were sharper than either of the humans, started to squawk and flap his ghostly wings. Serge couldn't see or hear the raven, but Rolando left off speaking suddenly and began examining their surroundings through the windows. Serge, while keeping an eye on the road, shot quick glances at his passenger. What is it?
Poe has spotted something which may be of interest to us in our quest, though I cannot yet see what has him so agitated, Rolando said. Wait, there! He pointed through the corner of the front windshield. Do you see it? That windmill there.
Serge looked as best he could without veering out of his lane. Off to their right rose the Trask Mountain Range, a portion of the Coast Range which runs parallel to the Pacific shore and hugs one side of the Willamette Valley. Though not dotted with a utility-scale wind farm like the Columbia Gorge, a few of the farms sported smaller turbines for their own use, and one stood in a field some miles off, its size difficult to estimate because of the perspective. The large blades were turning normally, but the whole structure swayed back and forth out of time and far more violently than the gentle breeze tickling the branches of the trees. Wind turbines, Serge corrected. Technically, because they don't mill anything. They make electricity. But that one looks like it's about to fall over.
And can you see why? Said Sanchez.
Rolando asked. Something about the older man's tone reminded Serge of teachers in school, asking questions not to find out answers, but to test students. Maybe it's broken?
Ah, Rolando said. Well, not yet, but it's being broken, methinks. Quickly, take us there. We will confront the one doing this great misdeed, for righting wrongs is one of the main charges of my vows of chivalry.
Wait, over there? I don't even know how we would get there. Should I... He motioned toward the upcoming exit, one of the smaller ones, which led to a stretch of road he didn't recognize.
See, and if you can find the roads to get there, all the better, but if you must drive directly through the fields, that would be acceptable, as long as your horseless wagon does not get stuck in the mud.
Serge would not have seriously considered off-roading through a farmer's field in his 2007 Toyota Corolla, but luckily he did find a road leading from the highway intersecting the freeway which led in the direction of the shaking turbine, then a long gravel road heading straight for it. The field on their left side was used for growing some kind of grass seed being a major export of the Willamette Valley. The grass at your local golf course probably started as seed in Oregon. After the seed was harvested, then the grass turned into hay for feed. The field was tilled for the winter, so it was just mud. On their right, latticework rose 20 feet in the air. In the spring, hops plants would be planted at the base, and the vines would climb all the way to the top by fall before the hops would be removed and processed into the craft beers Oregon was more famous for than its grass seed. So you'll just have to trust me. If you've ever had far too much expensive beer and taken a piss out on a golf course, almost anywhere in the world, you were likely just reuniting Oregon agricultural products, which had taken a circuitous route to end up together once again.
All right, Rolando said, taking off his seatbelt and hitting the button to roll down the passenger window. Begin accelerating steadily as we approach the windmill, and when I tell you, hit the brakes and turn to the left. A controlled turn, about 45 degrees, and slow until you can come to a stop some safe distance away from the windmill.
Turbine, Serge said instinctively, and I don't understand. Rolando poked his cane through the window, then his head, then slithered up until he was sitting in the window frame. As he rose into the whipping wind, he reached back in and pulled on the seatbelt, extending it as far as it would go. Then he took a portion from the very top, wrapped it around his left hand, and used it to hold himself while he leaned slightly out of the car. "What the fuck?" shouted Serge, braking as hard as he dared without tossing the man out onto the hood.
"No, I said accelerate, don't brake, and turn until I give the order."
"I don't," Serge said. To his own amazement, he took his foot off the brake, though he didn't hit the gas immediately.
"Faster, Sarah," Rolando shouted. "The timing will be everything."
And for some reason Serge would never be able to explain, some combination of Rolando's authoritative voice, his charisma, and some magical element, Serge did as he was told, pressing down on the gas pedal, only slightly at first, and then harder, the speedometer climbing from the meager pace he'd adopted to traverse the gravel road to something closer to a standard street speed. Pebbles and larger rocks were yanked out of the sodden road and tossed up onto the car's undercarriage, producing a sound like a hailstorm which was inverted, pelting them from below. And through the din of the pinging stones, Serge heard Rolando shouting at something other than him. He suspected the older gentleman was shouting at the wind turbine itself.
Rolando waved his cane in the air over his head. "I command you to cease in your labors of evil and turn to face me, Lord Rolando de Santa Maria del Pi of Barcelona. If you submit, I pledge to let you live. But if we must confront one another in glorious combat, it will be to the glory of my beautiful lady Nuria of Barcelona that I shall cut you down. Bow and surrender, or prepare to taste my steel, villain."
Then Rolando poked his cane back into the car, grabbed the shaft with the hand wrapped in the seatbelt, gave the raven's skull a practiced half-turn, and yanked the blade out of the sheath. Serge only saw the briefest flash of shining steel before Rolando pulled the sword outside his car and began waving it in the air, but he recognized what it was. "Holy fucking shit!" he shouted.
"You have been warned, foul giant!" Rolando shouted,
and then Serge could tell the next shout was aimed at him.
"Turn and slow, 45 degrees, now!"
Serge did so as best he could. Rolando swung the blade upwards, over his head, then brought it back around in a wide arc as he leaned out of the car as far as he could. He felt the blade make contact both times, though it passed through the hardened flesh like a spoon through jello. His back to his foe, Rolando opened his left hand, releasing the seatbelt, and pushed off the seat with his shoes. The spurs on his bone armor cut deep holes into the upholstery, then slashed the seat's back in two long cuts as he leapt from the still-moving car. Serge slammed on the brakes, partly because he was fast approaching the end of the gravel drive and would be rolling into the muddy field beyond, but mostly because a person had just leapt through his car window. He was more concerned that the person was a man in his late 50s, and therefore quite elderly for such stunts in Serge's judgment, and not as concerned about the fact that the quote-unquote elderly man was his employer, who had pledged to pay him generously and would not be able to follow through if he were killed by a fall onto rocky gravel. Later, Serge would realize he needed some kind of contractual guarantee of payment, but in the moment he was more concerned about the physical horror show of fatal road rash he would find when he managed to stop the car. Rolando was not as spry as he'd been at 25, when he might have attempted to land on his feet. Knowing his limitations, he twisted and caught the ground with his left shoulder, rolling with his sword pointed out above his head so he wouldn't impale himself during the rough landing. He allowed the tumbling roll to carry him until it lost its kinetic energy, his bone armor absorbing most of the damage from the fall. Muddy but unscathed, he quickly stood, not the monkey flip of his younger self, but a spry step nonetheless, and he aimed the sword at his quarry. The giant wasn't moving, though it took huge, heaving breaths which caused its arched back to rise and fall. Rolando's first swing had sliced the center of the giant's palm as it reached down to try and swat him out of the car, and Rolando's flourish had sliced the giant's Achilles tendon, bringing it down to its current position. The giant's weight rested on one knee, one foot, and his left hand, which was splayed before him. The leg which couldn't support his weight below the ankle lay on the ground from the knee to the top of his right foot. His other leg was bent 90 degrees at the knee, like a person doing a dangerously low lunge. The left hand helped hold him up, and the giant began shaking the right hand as though it was covered in something wet and sticky he wanted to fling away. Surge brought the car to a stop and threw open his door, leaving the engine running. When he looked back, the crazy man was standing. Not dead, not ground beef strewn across the gravel road, but standing on his own 2 feet, pointing his sword away from Surge toward the turbine.
"Yield," Rolando cried. "I will now dictate the terms of your surrender, foul creature, and thou shalt hearken carefully to my words and obey, for your only alternative is—"
Faster than Rolando expected, the giant converted the flapping of his pained hand into a flashing backhanded slap. Rolando couldn't dodge quickly enough, but he drove the sword into the oncoming hand, the blade passing between the bones in the back of the giant's palm and piercing through to the other side. When the giant's hand hit Rolando in the shoulder, he went flying. He held onto the handle of the sword, taking Poe's skull along for the ride, but the cane's blade broke between the giant's bones. Surge couldn't see who Rolando shouted at, but he couldn't help but notice his gentleman employer suddenly launched into the air, flailing then falling onto his side, sliding through the gravel and mud, a staticky, grinding roar accompanying the impact. But Surge's eyes caught something else. The glint of sunlight reflecting off of metal flickered in the air, and once he noticed it, he saw the blood floating in the air around it. It hovered at about Surge's eye level, and he couldn't comprehend the visual input. It looked like a sculpture of red wax made by pouring the hot liquid over some surface, then peeling it off and suspending it from some invisible fishing line. As Surge tried to envision the shape of the object, the wax had been poured around. The gravel in front of him crunched again, and he noticed a second of these red sculptures. This one something like a vase with an angled head, the red wax curving down around some cylindrical shape, then spreading above the ground into something else. Something that looked like an enormous foot. Surge looked back toward the other floating sculpture and caught it ascending and twisting, and he started to make out something that resembled a familiar shape, though the proportions were wildly off. While he examined it, the object not only elevated, but shifted, turning from something that looked like an enormous hand into a large, blocky fist covered in red liquid. And then, above that red fist, he saw a third shape made out of dripping blood. It was clearly a half of a gargantuan face. It was looking down at him through a blood-rimmed, invisible eye, and it was not happy. Surge looked to Rolando for some kind of explanation and discovered the man running right at him from the other side of the whatever the thing was. Rolando kicked forward in a practice side snap, his heel smashing into the spot where he'd sliced the giant's Achilles tendon. The giant's leg buckled, its knee pushing Surge in the middle of the squire's chest. Luckily, Surge stumbled back before falling onto his butt. The few steps saved him from being crushed when the giant's knee smashed down between his splayed feet, sinking a wide, shallow hole into the gravel in front of him. Rolando leapt up onto the giant's calf, using the muscle as a springboard, and jumped as high as he could, sinking the remainder of his sword into the giant's back. It sank into the heel of Rolando's hand, and might have been a fatal blow if the blade were intact, but even with only 5 inches of steel remaining, it cut into the giant's lung. Then Rolando used the exposed hilt of the sword like a climber's piton to haul himself up and grip onto the giant's collar. The giant's shirt was made out of some thick boiled leather, which made for a solid gripping space, and once Rolando's left was secure, he pulled his sword out with his right and pressed it sideways against the giant's neck. "Cry yield or die, giant!"
"I yield,"
the giant boomed. Surge heard the thunderous voice, and suddenly he could see the giant right in front of him, its thigh as wide as a tree trunk between his feet, its torso as wide as Surge was tall, its head more than 4 feet high itself. The giant, standing, would have been almost 30 feet tall, and even crouched on a knee, it looked down on Surge from height and position that made Surge feel like a toddler. It sported a wild, scraggly beard and long, greasy hair flowing from around a bald patch. Its nose was large and crooked like it had been broken repeatedly. Its brow was so pronounced that the eyes, small for the size of its face, were hidden in deep shadow. Surge scooted back on his butt with the kind of panicked motions he should have employed during the fight itself. Of course, a person can only behave in the way that is truly appropriate once they can correctly see what has been right in front of them all along, and even then, it takes a while to adjust. In this way, Surge's butt scooting was an apt metaphor for learning real American history. Rolando slid down the giant's back and plopped onto the ground, his stylish European boots eliciting a healthy crunch from the gravel. The giant ignored Serge scooting in front of him and looked over his shoulder at Rolando.
Would you mind taking the piece of your blade out of my hand before we discuss the terms of my surrender, Sir Knight? It hurts like having a blade stuck through your hand.
That's reasonable, Rolando said, and calmly walked around the giant. It's a trap, Serge Admiral Akbard. Don't go near it. The giant slowly turned his massive head in Serge's direction.
Watch the pronouns there. I'm a person, not an it. My name is Hirvorad the Undefeatable. I presume you are the Knight's secretary, and in your accounting, I expect to be identified accordingly.
Serge tried to take all this in, and he felt dizzy. Part of his mind turned to his surprise that the giant was so well-spoken. He'd presumed the giant would be stupid and comically inarticulate. Another part of his brain activated his shame response at being called out for his dehumanizing language. His prefrontal cortex tried to pull the compass needle back to the fact that he was looking up at a living, breathing, bleeding mythological creature, but that part was superseded by the portion trying to calm his panic response by reminding him he was no longer in danger, and it tricked his mouth into saying, "Guess you'll have to change that undefeated part." Instead of lashing out or even frowning, the giant smiled, revealing a clear cut of irregular brown stumps of teeth, crooked and flat and spaced out too widely.
Perhaps, though when people hear I was defeated by Lord Rolando de Santa Maria del Pi, I expect they will give me a pass. If not, Hirvorad, the once defeated, still has a nice ring to it.
Rolando walked around the giant and held out a hand like he was waiting for a small gift. The giant held his own hand, palm up, in front of Rolando, at about Rolando's waist height, and it was large enough to remind Serge of a dinette table. Rolando examined the piece of his sword cane sticking out of the middle of the giant's palm, bent down to examine the other end, then motioned for Hirvorad to flip his hand over, which the giant did. Rolando went to work trying to pull the blade out, a task complicated by the giant's blood and Rolando's inability to grip all the way around the blade without cutting his own fingers. He had to pinch it hard and then wiggle it back and forth as he worked the blade free from the back of the giant's hand, a process that made Hirvorad wince with each jerk back and forth. "You've heard of?" Serge asked, motioning to Rolando.
Oh, of course,
the giant said, his jaw stiff from the pain.
He is very famous among the giant community. He's slain quite a few of us over the years.
Rolando nodded at this, but refrained from interjecting immediately, focusing on his own task. Then, as he worked, almost like a mechanic talking to someone while continuing to stare at the engine, he said, "Since you have heard of me, Hirvorad the Undefeatable, why didn't you surrender immediately when I announced myself?"
Honestly, I thought I could take you by surprise, and I still believe I could have gotten a couple more blows in if your raven hadn't surprised me.
"Yes, Poe is an invaluable ally in battle," Rolando said as he plucked the broken portion of the blade from the giant's hand and carefully placed it in an interior pocket inside his wool coat. Then he held up his hand with 2 fingers extended. For the first time, Serge saw the ghost raven as it descended and perched there. Poe croaked, "Beso?" Rolando turned his head and offered Poe his right cheek, then his left. The bird nuzzled his beak and forehead against Rolando's face in a European-style greeting. The skullless head then raised up and turned to examine the giant dispassionately. Poe's beak and talons lacked material form, and his beak was on the pommel of Rolando's sword cane, but they could still affect the material world, as proven by the cuts on Hirvorad's forehead and cheek where the raven had made a brief stop as it rushed by, fluttering and scratching, obscuring the giant's sight long enough for Rolando to make his first blows, but flying off before the giant could grab him. Poe, when making contact with the material world, became vulnerable to physical attacks himself, but the well-trained raven understood his role in a fight, darting in and out until calm was restored, then returning to Rolando for the reward of the man's approval, since he could no longer consume treats. Serge gaped at the ghost of a raven on Rolando's proffered perch, then saw Rolando's armor for the first time. You really are a knight, and some kind of magic something." "A warrior mage, a knight-errant who employs strength of arms and magic in tandem to defeat evil, defend the defenseless, and bring glory to the Lady Nuria of Barcelona, in whose name I perform my great deeds." Serge motioned to Hirvorad. And he's evil? He seems nice now."
Giants are not without honor. In fact, a few have renounced their giantish ways and become great knights-errant themselves. But they are mostly evil. They serve the powers of darkness in exchange for their preferred rewards.
Serge looked at the giant. What are those? Hirvarad shrugged.
We eat human children. They taste better than human adults. Like veal. It's a highly controversial predilection. Many in the magical community find it distasteful. Others hire us and pay us in abducted children.
He shrugged.
It's the system, you know.
Then he stood, all 30 feet of him, and tested his weight on the leg with the severed Achilles, barely pressing the toe to the ground, then wincing and returning to standing on the other foot alone.
You really did a number on me, Sir Knight. I don't know how I'm going to get home.
Rolando nodded. As you have surrendered, I will give you one of my own potions of healing to repair your ankle and cure your other minor wounds, so that you can leave here and journey to the manor of the Lady Nuria. Fall on your knees before her glorious beauty and tell her of your defeat in combat at my hand. But before I heal your wounds, we have other terms we must negotiate.
Serge looked back and forth between the giant and the knight, then focused on Rolando. You're going to heal him and set him free? He eats children.
Yes, my esquire is quite correct, Hirvarad. The first term of your surrender is that you will pledge, on your honor, not to eat any more human children for as long as you live.
Hirvarad's shoulders slumped in a show of petulant disappointment.
Perhaps we could set a time limit of some kind? No children for 5 years?
No, I'm sorry, but that's non-negotiable.
Rolando said this like a preschool teacher explaining basic civil behavior to a toddler.
No more eating children. Ever. On pain of death. Understood?
What do you consider to be a child? What about teenagers? Or tweens? I think they call them tweens now. Could I eat a 12-year-old?
No! Serge shouted. What? No! Rolando, don't let him eat any humans. Now it was Rolando's turn to shrug.
I cannot demand the giant becomes a vegetarian. I am already challenging his nature. He pointed a finger at Hirvorad. But no one under 18, and try to keep the number of adults to a minimum. Consider switching to sheep. And for a challenge, venison.
Baby lambs and baby deer are quite tasty,
the giant said.
Especially when they are so young their bones are still soft. I think I could make that adjustment to my diet.
I vote you kill him, Serge said.
The code forbids me to execute an opponent I defeat in battle who is observing the terms of surrender, and it certainly prohibits me from killing an adversary during a parley about said terms.
He returned his attention to the giant.
Also, you must tell me who sent you to destroy this windmill.
Turbine, Serge corrected automatically. Hirvarad shook his head.
It wasn't this particular windmill.
He looked at Serge.
And yes, it's a turbine. Don't be a pedant.
Then back to Rolando.
I was given a list. It was long. I can't remember everything on the list. Windmills, libraries that host readings by drag queens, sporting facilities where trans athletes are allowed to participate, daycare facilities that allow the children of undocumented immigrants, houses of worship where most of the congregants are people of color. I didn't see any consistent pattern in the list. No people to eat. I'm supposed to smash up buildings and other objects, but only here in the United States. I would prefer to vandalize them in some more creative way. You should see my graffiti. I can paint very high up on buildings, and I have a really cool style if I do say so myself. But no one hires giants for our creative talents. They just say, "You're big and strong, go smash things."
He shrugged.
It's a living.
And who hired you to do this smashing? Rolando asked.
No idea. It was just a posting on a job board.
He looked at Serge.
Monster.com, but a password-protected subsection for non-humans.
Some of those job listings are scams, Serge said. How did you know they would pay?
They paid half in advance. 4 toddlers up front, 4 when I get back home.
Holy shit, Serge breathed. That's horrible.
Yeah,
Arvarad agreed.
Even if they pay me a portion of the rest for an incomplete job, what will I do with the toddlers? I'm now forsworn from eating them.
Return them. Set them free. The giant scratched his head.
Maybe I could drop them off at a hospital or a fire station or something. Or give them to a friend.
No, Serge shouted. No, Rolando said simultaneously and far more calmly, wagging a finger.
That would violate the spirit of our terms. No delivering children to be eaten either.
Fucking small print.
So, when these children were delivered, what could you surmise about your employer based upon the delivery method?
Rolando asked.
Were they delivered by humans? Speaking what language? Any distinguishing features?
Just a normal FedEx driver,
Hirvarad said.
Brown truck, high socks.
Serge shook his head and tried to find words. Rolando was disappointed.
All right, my next charge to you is this. Whenever and however you can communicate with the person who tasked you with this list of targets, find out what you can without making them too suspicious, and relay that information to me.
Fair enough. This is a small task for the price of my life. Much less of an imposition than refraining from eating human children.
Yes, but that is not the most important task. Now you must leave this cursed land, travel by whatever means suits you, and reach the city of Barcelona. There you must find the Lady Nuria and tell her I defeated you in glorious battle. Inform her that I cried her name, and strengthened by her favor, dealt you the great blow which brought you to your knees.
That's the most important part? Serge asked. More important than not eating kids? More important than finding the origin of the curse? Telling this Nuria lady that you're so great? That's the big priority?
Yes, said Sanchez. That is the priority, for it is the code. I shall explain it to you as we continue our voyage. But first, Hirvarad, the once defeated, do you agree to these terms of surrender in exchange for your life?
The giant hung his head solemnly.
I do. It will be no small thing to travel to Barcelona to meet your lady. As you can see, I can't fit in an airplane. I had to hitch a ride on a cargo ship to travel here to this cursed land.
See, Rolando interrupted. I told you, this land is cursed.
Of course,
the giant said.
Everyone knows that. I will travel to Barcelona, as I have promised. I have some cousins and uncles and aunts who live in the Pyrenees. It will be good to see them. And then I can travel through the Alps and visit more family on the way back home to Svalbard. I will try to contact my employer to see if I can switch my pay to your human money, and maybe that will give you a trail to follow.
Are you the curse? Serge asked, pointing at the electric turbine. I mean, all of you? This, giants around the country, smashing things and causing mayhem?
Hirvarad frowned. No, I think the curse is magical in nature. This task of mine, the list, I think it is perhaps meant to augment the curse, or distract from it. But I can only speculate. They don't even hire me to paint my graffiti murals, so of course they do not include me in their planning.
Rolando fished a small, thin vial of a burgundy liquid out of the interior pocket of his coat and held it up to Hirvarad. The giant pinched it with surprising gentleness, then tossed back the contents. The wound on his forehead sealed immediately, as did the slice in the interior of his palm. The puncture through the hand, the stab wound in his back, and the cut Achilles began to knit together, though they would linger. The giant took a few small, shuffling steps to make sure he could put his full weight on the injured leg, then nodded at Rolando.
Good enough. Do you have a business card so I may contact you when I have information?
Rolando pulled an ornate silver case out of a different interior pocket, opened it, drew a card, and held it up between two fingers. The giant reached down and plucked it carefully, sliding it into a pouch which hung from his belt. The pouch seemed to be made out of leather, but Serge felt a wave of nausea as he realized he wasn't sure what kind of skin that leather came from. Hirvarad nodded to the two humans and walked off through the farmer's field without another word. Serge expected the giant to become invisible once again, but he could see him clearly all the way to the edge of the field. When Hirvarad crossed the street, Serge expected a traffic disaster, as drivers honked their horns and wrenched their wheels, preferring to drive into ditches on either side rather than approaching the 30-foot-tall creature. The cars didn't even slow. "They can't see him," Serge whispered. He turned back to Rolando and saw, quite clearly, the knight's bone armor under his jacket, and the headless raven skeleton now perched on the man's shoulder. "I couldn't see," he faltered, "but now I still see it."
"Yes, my esquire. Once you see these things, you cannot stop, and you will perceive much more besides. If you are witnessed reacting to things other humans cannot see, they will believe you are out of your wits, mad, bonkers, insane. That is how they protect themselves. Be gentle with them. Anger towards those who are not ready to see will only make you a bitter, unlikable person. But you will already be separated from them. It's inescapable. And I would apologize for this, for the isolation I have imposed upon you. But I cannot. For it is no crime to help our fellows see what endangers them, the hidden world, the evils which surround us all. To see these things is frightening, and it will set you apart. But the alternative is to be unaware. And that kind of ignorance is no real protection, and no gift, though you may sometimes think it so.
Serge nodded slowly. All right, I guess I understand that. He looked off into the field. So what's this code? You said you'd explain it.
Rolando almost bounced with enthusiasm. Yes, the code. Let us proceed onward to Corbais, and I will explain the ways of the knight-errant, the warrior mage, and the beauty that belongs to the Lady Nuria of Barcelona.
Serge stumbled toward his car, overwhelmed to the point of numbness, but he nodded his head in a slow rhythm, accepting this plan. As Rolando followed his chauffeur to the car, Poe mimicked Serge's nodding, bobbing its head up and down, as though picking through a pile of straw for a seed hiding underneath. Rolando smiled broadly at his bird's display, careful not to laugh aloud, then returned to organizing his thoughts for the explanation of the code of chivalry which ordered his life. But that explanation, dear reader, will have to wait a bit, because first, in our next chapter, we must flash backwards to Madrid, where Rolando was charged with the quest to cure this cursed country. If you're excited about this project, please subscribe on YouTube or like and share on TikTok or Reels or whatever app you're on now. And if you're willing to support me as I craft this novel in serial form, please consider supporting my Substack or Patreon. Each week I'll give a shout out to some of those patrons. This week I'm thanking Substack subscribers S. Via, Anemonia, and Chris Early. Thank you all for your continued support. I'd also like to encourage you all to support the Kickstarter for author John Dover's next vampire western, A Fistful of Fangs. I got to read the ARC, and it's so much bloody fun. You can pre-order your copy for only $20, but he has a bunch of other cool rewards to check out, so look that up or use the link in the show notes. If you have something to plug, please email NotAPipePublishing at NotAPipePublishing@gmail.com. See you back here next week for Chapter 4 of Tilting at Windmills.